She was just a black mom stopping at her favorite coffee shop, hoping to enjoy a quiet morning. But things didn't stay quiet for long. A cop approached, made an insulting remark, and everything changed. What the officer didn't know was that her son, just steps away, held a badge that would leave the officer speechless. The moment he revealed it, you could hear a pin drop. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Her name was Sharon, and she was a single mom, well known in her neighborhood for her warmth and resilience. She was the type of woman who always had a kind word for her neighbors, the first to offer help when someone was in need. Life wasn't always easy for Sharon. She worked long hours, took care of her kids, and still managed to show up with a smile. People admired her strength, but not everyone saw her the same way. There were those who didn't bother to look past the color of her skin, who thought they could treat her however they pleased. Her son, Michael, had grown up seeing Sharon's struggles. He knew how hard she worked, how much she gave to the community, and how unfairly she was sometimes treated. Michael had always been protective of his mother. He was a quiet, unassuming guy, modest, kind, and fiercely loyal. But what most people didn't know about Michael was that he had worked his way up in law enforcement. Through years of dedication, he had earned the rank of police chief in their city. He never flaunted it, and most people had no idea who he really was when he wasn't wearing his uniform. To Michael, being a good cop meant listening, learning, and serving, not showing off a badge. It was an ordinary morning when Sharon decided to run a quick errand. She stopped by the local cafe to pick up a coffee and a pastry before heading to work. She was standing at the counter, chatting with the barista, when a police officer walked in. At first, Sharon didn't pay much attention. She was just another customer in line, minding her own business. But something about the officer's demeanor caught her off guard. This officer wasn't someone she recognized. He wasn't part of the usual community patrol. He was a younger guy, new to the area. Maybe it was the way he glanced at her, or the tone he used when he spoke. But Sharon felt uneasy. And then came the comment that changed everything. It was a passing remark, muttered under his breath, but loud enough for her to hear. The words hit her like a slap. She froze, gripping the counter to steady herself. People around her exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what they'd just witnessed. Michael, sitting at a corner table nearby, saw his mother's reaction. He couldn't hear exactly what was said, but he knew her well enough to recognize when something was wrong. As the officer moved closer, still oblivious to who Sharon was or who her son was, Michael got up from his seat. He walked over calmly, his badge still tucked out of sight, but his presence commanding attention. The cafe was quiet now, the atmosphere tense. The barista looked nervous, the other patrons awkwardly shifting in their seats. The officer glanced at Michael, not realizing he was her son, and casually dismissed him. "This doesn't concern you," the cop said. But it concerned Michael more than anything. This was his mom. This was the woman who had sacrificed so much for him, who had taught him the importance of kindness and respect. And now she was being disrespected in front of everyone. What the officer didn't know was that Michael was about to reveal something that would shift the entire situation. In that moment, Michael knew he had to step in, not just as a son, but as someone who had worked hard to ensure justice was served in his city. He wanted to remind this officer and everyone watching that no one should ever be judged or insulted based on who they are or how they look. The officer's comment, though quick and offhand, stung deeply. Sharon stood there, feeling the weight of it. The barista avoided eye contact. The room grew quieter, and the officer didn't seem to care. He glanced around, shifting his weight like he had no idea the storm he'd just started. Sharon, ever calm and composed, cleared her throat and said, "Excuse me." The officer turned back to her, his expression bored and dismissive. "What's the problem?" he asked. "You heard me." Sharon's hands tightened on her coffee cup. She'd dealt with moments like these before. Snide remarks, people thinking they could talk down to her just because of the color of her skin. But this felt different. This wasn't some random passerby. This was someone in uniform, someone who was supposed to serve and protect, not belittle and insult. "Why would you say that?" Sharon asked, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't going to let it slide. This wasn't the first time someone had made an assumption about her, but it wasn't every day she had the chance to address it directly. The officer tilted his head slightly, as if he couldn't believe she was challenging him. "I don't need to explain myself," he said, a hint of irritation creeping into his tone. "If you have a problem, you can take it up with the department." Michael, who had been quietly sipping his coffee nearby, caught the shift in his mom's voice. He turned his head, his eyes narrowing. Something wasn't right. He stood up, his tall frame drawing the officer's attention. The officer glanced at him briefly, then dismissed him just as quickly. He had no idea who Michael was. "Is there a reason you're speaking to her that way?" Michael asked, stepping closer. His voice was calm, steady, but it carried a weight that made the officer pause. The officer frowned, clearly annoyed. "This doesn't concern you," he said sharply. "It's between me and her." Michael didn't flinch. He'd dealt with plenty of confrontations in his line of work, but this was personal. This was his mom. "I think it does concern me," he said. "She's my mother, and I'm asking why you felt the need to insult her." Sharon placed a gentle hand on Michael's arm, as if to calm him. "It's okay," she said quietly. "I'm used to it." Michael shook his head. "No, it's not okay." He looked back at the officer. "You're out of line. You can't just walk in here and treat people like that." The officer rolled his eyes. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I don't need a lecture. If she has a problem, she can file a complaint. Otherwise, we're done here." Michael's jaw tightened. He didn't raise his voice, didn't take a step closer, but his presence filled the room. "I think you should reconsider your tone," he said evenly. "This isn't how you should be addressing anyone, especially someone who's done nothing wrong." The officer's expression hardened. "And what are you going to do about it?" he sneered. He didn't bother hiding his disdain. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" Sharon stayed quiet, her gaze flicking between her son and the officer. She knew Michael well enough to recognize that he wasn't going to back down, but she also knew he wasn't someone who let his anger get the best of him. He had a way of staying calm, staying measured, even when others didn't. Michael took a small breath, then reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly, he pulled out his badge and held it up for the officer to see. The entire cafe seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused in midair. The barista, who had been nervously rearranging napkins, froze in place. "You're a cop?" the officer asked, his voice suddenly quieter. "Not just a cop," Michael replied, his tone steady. "I'm the police chief." The officer's face turned a shade paler. He glanced at the badge, then at Michael's face, then back to the badge. For a moment, it seemed like he couldn't quite process what was happening. "You're—" he started, but the words stuck in his throat. "And that's my mother," Michael said firmly. His voice carried a weight that silenced any murmurs in the room. "The woman you just insulted is my mom." The officer's mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. He looked at Sharon, then back at Michael, clearly unsure of what to say. You owe her an apology, Michael continued. His tone wasn't loud, but it was commanding. Right now, I didn't mean, the officer stammered. His bravado from earlier had vanished. It's not about what you meant, Michael said. It's about what you said. Apologize. The officer took a step back, looking genuinely shaken. I'm sorry, he muttered, barely audible. Say it so she can hear it, Michael said. The officer cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry, he repeated, louder this time. Sharon looked at her son, her expression a mix of pride and gratitude. She gave the officer a slight nod. Thank you, she said simply. Michael lowered his badge, but he didn't take his eyes off the officer. We're done here, he said. The officer nodded quickly, turned on his heel, and walked out of the cafe without another word. As soon as the door closed behind him, the tension in the room seemed to lift. People started whispering, exchanging wide-eyed looks. The barista let out a breath she'd apparently been holding for several minutes. Michael turned to his mom. Are you okay? He asked. She smiled at him, a warm, reassuring smile that only a mother could give. I'm fine, she said. Thank you. Michael put his badge away, reached for her coffee, and handed it to her. Let's go, he said. They walked out together, leaving behind a room full of people who would be telling this story for days, weeks, maybe even years. Once they were outside, Sharon finally let out a small laugh. You didn't have to do all that, she said, though her tone was light. Yes, I did, Michael replied. Nobody gets to talk to you like that. And with that, they headed home, leaving the memory of that encounter behind, but knowing it had left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. As the cafe grew silent, all eyes were on the officer and Michael. The barista froze mid-pour, and customers stopped mid-sentence. The tension was so thick it felt like even the air itself had paused to see what would happen next. Michael locked eyes with the officer. Do you know who I am? He asked, his voice calm yet unyielding. The badge in his hand glinted in the light, the insignia clear for everyone to see. For a split second, confusion flickered on the officer's face, then came recognition. The color drained from his cheeks, and his confident posture faltered. He shifted his weight uneasily. You're... His voice trailed off, the realization hitting him like a freight train. That's right, Michael said, his tone steady. I'm the police chief, and this woman you just insulted is my mother. The room went utterly still. No one dared to move or speak. The customers who had initially kept their heads down now exchanged wide-eyed glances. Someone near the back whispered, "Oh, no, he messed up big time." The officer's mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. His bravado from earlier had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. He started to stammer. I didn't mean—" Michael raised his hand, cutting him off. "Save it," he said firmly. "I'm not interested in excuses. I'm interested in respect, something you clearly don't understand." The officer's jaw clenched. He looked around the cafe as if searching for a way out, but there was none. The other patrons weren't about to come to his defense. They had heard the insult. They had seen his arrogance. And now they were watching as he squirmed under the weight of his own actions. Sharon, standing tall beside her son, didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The quiet strength in her presence spoke volumes. She had faced her share of disrespect and prejudice before, but this time was different. This time, she didn't have to stand alone. Michael stepped closer to the officer. "What you just said to my mother was unacceptable. I don't care what you thought, or how you justified it in your head. It was wrong." The officer swallowed hard. I didn't realize. Exactly. Michael cut him off again. you didn't realize because you didn't care to. You didn't stop to think about who she is, what she's been through, or how your words might affect her. You just assumed you could say whatever you wanted without consequences. Well, let me be very clear. There are consequences. The officer's shoulders sagged. His earlier confidence, his dismissive attitude had completely crumbled. He looked at Sharon, then back at Michael, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and fear. I'm sorry, he muttered. Michael didn't let him off the hook that easily. Sorry for what? He demanded. Say it clearly. Say it so she can hear you. The officer hesitated, then spoke louder. I'm sorry for what I said. It was disrespectful, and I shouldn't have said it. Sharon finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Apology accepted. Just remember, words matter. They can hurt more than you think. Michael nodded. Good. Now, I expect you to take some time to think about what happened here. Think about how you treat people, and how your actions reflect on this department. The officer nodded, his eyes downcast. I will. See that you do, Michael said. He turned to Sharon. Mom, let's go. They walked out of the cafe together, leaving the officer standing there, the weight of his actions hanging over him. The customers began whispering among themselves again, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others murmuring words of admiration for Michael and Sharon. Outside, the sun shone brightly, casting a warm light on the mother and son as they strolled down the sidewalk. Sharon glanced at Michael and said, You didn't have to do all that, you know. Yes, I did, Michael replied. You deserve respect. Always. Sharon smiled. Well, I appreciate it. I really do. Michael smiled back. It's the least I can do, after all you've done for me. As they walked on, their bond felt even stronger than before. They knew that the incident wasn't just about one moment in a cafe. It was about standing up for what's right, about showing that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. And while the officer would have to deal with the fallout of his actions, Sharon and Michael could move forward knowing they had handled the situation with grace and strength. What happened next didn't stay confined to the cafe. Word spread quickly. Customers shared the story with friends, and soon the local paper picked it up. The headline read, Police Chief Steps In to Defend His Mother. People all over the city began talking about it. Some were outraged at the officer's behavior. Others were inspired by Michael's calm yet firm response. The incident became a hot topic at community meetings, church gatherings, and even around dinner tables. Sharon received calls from neighbors and old friends, many of them sharing their own stories of similar encounters. It happens all the time, one woman told her. We just never have anyone to back us up. You're lucky your son was there. Lucky? Sharon said. I think it's less about luck and more about teaching people to stand up for what's right. That's what I taught Michael, and I'm glad he didn't hesitate to act. For Michael, the attention was both unexpected and uncomfortable. He had never been one to seek the spotlight. I just did what anyone should do, he said whenever someone praised him. It shouldn't be newsworthy to treat someone with respect. That should be the norm. But the community's reaction showed that, for many, respect wasn't always guaranteed. People were tired of feeling overlooked, disrespected, and dismissed. Michael's stand became a symbol of hope, proof that dignity and fairness could win out. The officer involved was called in for a formal review. As part of his disciplinary action, he was required to attend mandatory training sessions on bias and respect. Michael insisted that the department go further. This can't just be a one-off, he told his fellow leaders. We need to make sure every officer knows how to handle situations with integrity, no matter who they're dealing with. In the months that followed, the department implemented new policies. Officers were given additional training on cultural sensitivity, communication skills, and community engagement. The department's leadership team held regular meetings with community members, listening to their concerns and working to rebuild trust. Sharon, though not one for public attention, was invited to speak at several community forums. She talked about her experience, not as a victim, but as a proud mother who had seen her son take a stand. "It's not just about what happened to me," she said. "It's about what happens to so many people every day. This time, my son was there. Next time, it might be someone else's son or daughter who steps up. But we all need to remember that we're worth respect, every single one of us." Michael stood in the back of the room as his mother spoke, his heart swelling with pride. He knew that the work was far from over. Changing a culture wasn't something that happened overnight. But he also knew that this moment, this single act of standing up for his mom, had set something in motion. And that was enough to keep him moving forward. What no one expected was how far the impact of that day would reach. In the days that followed, the story of Michael and Sharon spread through the community. Neighbors and local business owners started talking about it. They couldn't believe that an officer could act so arrogantly toward a respected member of the community, let alone in such a public place. At first, the story circulated quietly, just a few people sharing it with their friends and family. But then, someone who had been at the cafe posted about the encounter online. Within hours, the post started gaining traction, and soon enough, local news outlets picked it up. Sharon hadn't thought much of the encounter after it happened. She was used to dealing with rudeness and prejudice. What mattered to her was that Michael stood up for her. But when a local news crew showed up at her front door one morning, she was taken by surprise. They wanted to know what had happened, how it had all unfolded, and how she felt about her son stepping in so publicly. Sharon wasn't sure how to answer at first. She didn't see herself as a victim or a hero. She was just a mother who had raised her son to know right from wrong. Michael, on the other hand, was more reluctant to speak. "I don't need any recognition," he said when the reporters approached him. "What I did wasn't about making a point. It was about doing the right thing. It's really that simple." Despite his protests, the story continued to spread. More and more people started talking about the need for respect and fairness. Community leaders began hosting discussions on how to address biases within the local police department. Even officers who weren't involved in the incident felt compelled to speak out. Some acknowledged that they had seen similar behavior before and hadn't always stepped up to stop it. Now they realized that silence wasn't the answer. They needed to be proactive in changing the culture within their department. One day, Michael received a call from the city mayor. The mayor congratulated him on how he handled the situation and invited him to a meeting with other city leaders to discuss potential reforms. At first, Michael hesitated. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He was just a guy who went to work every day and tried to do his best. But as he thought about it, he realized that this might be an opportunity to create lasting change. If one incident could spark so much conversation, then maybe it could also lead to real action. During the meeting, Michael shared his perspective. He talked about how respect should be the foundation of any interaction, whether it's between an officer and a civilian or between two colleagues. "If we can't treat people with basic dignity, then we've failed," he said. His words resonated with the other leaders in the room. They started brainstorming ways to ensure that every officer understood the importance of community relationships and cultural sensitivity. Meanwhile, Sharon found herself in a new role within her neighborhood. People who had known her for years now approached her with their own stories of dealing with prejudice or mistreatment. Some shared their frustrations, while others asked for advice. Sharon listened patiently and offered whatever support she could. "We can't change the past," she told one neighbor, "but we can learn from it and make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes." As time passed, the officer who had insulted Sharon faced his own reckoning. He was required to attend extensive training sessions on bias and cultural awareness. Additionally, the department instituted a mentorship program where newer officers could learn from more experienced ones who exemplified integrity and respect. Michael volunteered to help lead some of these sessions. He knew it wouldn't be an easy process, but he believed that change was possible if people were willing to put in the work. The public reaction to these initiatives was mixed at first. Some were skeptical, wondering if the reforms would truly make a difference. Others were hopeful, seeing them as a step in the right direction. Over time, as more officers embraced the new training and the community saw positive results, the skepticism began to fade. Residents reported feeling more comfortable interacting with the police. The relationship between law enforcement and the community started to improve. Sharon continued to go about her daily life, but now she carried herself with a little more confidence. She knew she had always been strong, but seeing her son stand up for her in such a powerful way reminded her of how far they had come as a family. She had raised a son who not only cared deeply about justice, but also had the courage to take action when it mattered most. One evening, as Sharon and Michael sat on the porch of her modest home, she turned to him and said, "You know, I never thought all of this would happen. I never imagined one moment in a cafe could lead to so much change." Michael smiled and shook his head. "Neither did I," he admitted, "but I'm glad it did. If it means more people get treated with respect, then it was worth it." As they sat together, the sun setting behind them, they felt a sense of peace. The journey wasn't over, and there was still work to be done. But they knew they had already made a difference, and in that moment, that was enough. After the confrontation at the cafe, Michael didn't stop with an apology and a disciplinary meeting. He knew that one incident wasn't enough to fix a deeper issue. Change wouldn't come from one officer's reprimand. It had to come from the entire system. Michael reached out to the department's training director to suggest mandatory cultural awareness workshops. "It's not about a single day of sensitivity training," he said. "It's about ongoing education, about understanding the community you serve, not judging it." The department agreed to pilot the program. Sharon, his mother, was invited to one of the sessions as a guest speaker. Sharon approached the room full of officers with a calm but commanding presence. She shared her story, not to shame or accuse, but to teach. She explained how subtle assumptions, like the one that officer had made in the cafe, can carry a lifelong impact. "People don't forget how you make them feel," she said. "Even if it's just a passing comment, the weight of it can stay with someone for years. You may think it's just words, but for us, it's a reminder of every other time we've been dismissed, disrespected, or made to feel like we don't belong." Her words landed like a quiet storm. Some officers sat in reflective silence, while others asked questions. "How do we change?" one young recruit asked. "What if we've never lived that experience? How do we really understand?" Sharon smiled, her voice steady. "Start by listening. Listen to people who don't look like you, who don't come from where you come from. Be humble enough to know you might not have all the answers. If you don't understand, ask. If you make a mistake, Own up to it. Change doesn't mean you're perfect. It means you're trying. Michael watched his mother speak, feeling a swell of pride. He knew she wasn't just telling her story. She was giving these officers a new perspective, one they could carry with them on every call, in every interaction. And it wasn't just the officers who benefited. Sharon felt lighter, too. For the first time in a long time, she felt heard. She wasn't just someone's mom who had been insulted. She was a voice for change. Over the next year, the department rolled out additional training modules, partnered with community leaders, and started attending neighborhood meetings. Michael made sure his officers weren't just there to listen, but to engage. "This is not a PR stunt," he told them. "If you're going to these meetings, you're going to contribute. Take notes, follow up, be present." The changes didn't happen overnight, and there were setbacks. Some officers resisted the new initiatives, claiming they didn't need training to just do their jobs. Others feared backlash from colleagues. But gradually, the culture started to shift. More officers began to speak up when they saw behavior that didn't align with the department's new values. Incidents of misconduct decreased, and public trust improved. For Michael, the biggest victory wasn't the policy changes or the training sessions. It was seeing his officers go out of their way to show compassion. He heard about officers helping a stranded motorist, volunteering at a community center, and even organizing a food drive. These weren't major events, but they were signs of progress. Sharon also became a regular presence in the community. Neighbors stopped her on the street to thank her for speaking out. "You gave us a voice," one woman said. "I didn't think it was possible, but things feel different now." Sharon always responded the same way. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us, and we have to keep it going." The story of that cafe incident eventually faded from the headlines, but its impact remained. The department continued to work on building trust, and Michael's leadership was recognized at a state level. He was invited to speak at a law enforcement summit, where he shared the steps his department had taken. At the summit, he said, "Real change doesn't come from a single moment. It comes from what you do after the moment passes. It's about commitment, accountability, and respect. You don't have to be perfect, but you have to care. And you have to keep showing up." Back home, Michael and Sharon remained grounded. They didn't see themselves as heroes, just people trying to do the right thing. Their bond grew even stronger, rooted in the shared experience of standing up for what mattered. Sharon continued to remind Michael that the fight for respect and dignity never ends. "You've made a difference," she told him one evening as they sat together on her porch. "But there's always more to do." Michael nodded. "I know," he said, "but I'm in it for the long haul." And so they carried on. Not as a mother and son who had once made headlines, but as a mother and son who believed in the power of persistence, the strength of community, and the enduring value of respect. So, what did we learn from this story? It's not just about standing up to someone who's wrong. It's about showing others the value of respect, the strength of community, and the importance of doing the right thing, even when it's not easy. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you do in a similar situation? Have you ever witnessed someone standing up for what's right in a moment that really mattered? Share your story in the comments below. If you found this story inspiring, please hit that like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more powerful stories. We're so grateful to have you here, and we can't wait to bring you even more content that makes a difference. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.